I think we're ready now. Yeah, I have sort of two objectives tonight. One is to tell you about the missing drum, and the other is to focus a little bit on the process that I've gone through looking for the missing drum. But I want to start by showing you this drum, which is not missing. Well, I don't know where it is now, actually, but this is a photograph that was taken in Red Lake, Minnesota, sometime shortly after 1900 by a pioneering ethnomusicologist, Francis Dinsmore. And Dinsmore was visiting the Ojibwa people who lived way up on the Canadian border. And she was quite interested in their music. And she took a picture, a photograph of this drum, and it was published in the BAE reports, that's the Bureau of American Ethnology, in 1905. So what I'm interested in showing you here about this drum is what it's made of, for one thing. So take a look at it. According to Dinsmore, it was made from the section of a bowl of a basswood tree. And it was hollowed out, and they put a kind of wooden plate on the bottom and tightly fitted it in there and sealed it up. And then across the top, they've taken a tanned deer hide and stretched it over the mouth. And then you'll notice the circumference of this drum is smaller at the top than it is at the bottom. So that allowed them to take a wooden hook and press it tightly down over the deer hide to tighten the head of the drum. Now, what you can't see in this photograph is that on the other side of the drum, there is a hole with a wooden peg sticking in it. And they could remove that peg and add water to the drum, because this drum was called a water drum. They would usually put something like 3 to 4 inches of water in the bottom of the drum. And this serves several purposes. One is they believe that it helped the sound of the drum carry to a greater distance. And another purpose was that if the head of the drum became loose, they could splash water up onto the deer skin from inside and then hold the drum next to a fire. And as the water dried, it would tighten the deer skin. And so in that sense, they could tune the drum. And there's probably another reason for the water as well, because there is a lot of mythology and symbolism that surrounds this drum. And for one thing, look at the drum mallet. Notice in the curve of the drum mallet, right here, you see what looks like an eye. They thought of the drum mallet as a bird, usually a loon, which is a bird of the northern lakes. The loon is really a quite interesting bird. It can dive very deep under the water. It comes out on land rarely, but it comes out to build a nest, and it flies in the air. So it can inhabit 3 different levels of the cosmos. Now, the Ojibwa speak an Algonquian language, and another tribe speaking Algonquian language, an Algonquian language, is the Mi'kmaq. This is a Mi'kmaq drum. It's a handheld single skin frame drum. And I got this one in Maine. Notice it has a bear paw on it. That also refers to the mythology surrounding drums among Algonquian-speaking people. And we'll get back to that in a minute. Now, let's see, won't advance the slide. Hang on just a minute, I'm having trouble here.
Do you want to go out on the deck and see what's time?
Okay, wait. Are you actually there?
Oh,
You were, I don't know.
okay,
Why?
all right, all right. Pardon the interruption. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about music archaeology and doing music archaeological research. It's a fairly similar to doing research in anything, except it has its own drawbacks and its own problems. But basically, what you see here is a model of the method and theory of music archaeology. In the center, you have what are generally thought of as the goals of music archaeology, which is to gain access to past musical behaviors and soundscapes. And the small circles around that are the kinds of data that you would consult in order to do that. Now, the problem with studying musical behaviors in the past is that music is something that only exists in time and not in space. So you can't dig it up, so to speak. And if you're dealing with people who lived before the time of recording devices, and that would be pretty much anyone before the late 19th century, or people who did not have any sort of musical notation system, it makes it particularly difficult to gain access to their musical behaviors. But it's not, so you can, in other words, you can never completely have access to these behaviors, but you can gain at least partial access to them. And it might help you to understand their culture a little better based on whatever it is you can learn about these behaviors and about the soundscapes that surrounded these people. So the drum that is missing is a kind of drum that should be here, be found in the Southeast prior to European contact, but we don't have one, and it's missing. Where is it? But it should be there, and I'll explain why in a minute. And actually, it probably is there. It's just that it's hiding in plain sight. And that drum is a ceramic vessel drum. The interesting thing about that drum I just showed you, the Ojibwa word for it is wooden pot, translates to wooden pot. So what we're looking for here is a pottery vessel that was used as a drum. And as far as I know, no one's ever recognized one of these in any kind of archaeological context. And the key word here is recognized, because I think there probably are quite a few of them, but how are we going to distinguish them from ordinary pots, ordinary vessels? So if when I started this out on this search, I had no music artifacts to go on. So I consulted historical records of early European contact with the native population of the Southeast. I looked at ethnographic information to get some idea of the music of descendant communities. And the problem with that, though, of course, it's been 500 years that since these people's ancestors were looking at their past music behaviors and not at the contemporary music behaviors. But the idea is if you look at the music of the descendant communities, you can sort of project back onto the past what the music of their ancestors was like. There's a danger in doing this. For the past 500 years, these people have been exposed to an alien culture. They've been exposed to the culture of the colonizers. And no matter how hard they've tried to keep their traditions alive, there probably is some influence on what they do now over what their ancestors did in the past. So you have to keep that in mind. And finally, iconology, the study of images. We're talking here about, about art, about pictures, about art that's either two-dimensional or three-dimensional. People in the past drew pictures and made sculptures of their activities, especially those they considered special. And sometimes in those depictions, you can find images of musical instruments. Now, let's talk about music artifacts again for just a minute. The problem with music artifacts is that they're extremely rare. And most of them, like those wooden drums I showed you, were made of ephemeral materials. So they just plain don't last in the archaeological record. And you could bury a drum like the Ojibwa water drum in the ground and leave it there for 500 years, and you would end up with nothing, basically. So that's a big problem. There are very few music artifacts to study. That seems especially true in the United States. Now, south of the border in Mexico, there are quite a few musical instruments because they made a lot of their instruments out of ceramics, out of pottery. And what I'm looking for is a ceramic drum. So the reason I got started on this is because of these two images from Spiro. What you're looking at are two large shell gorgets that were found at Spiro. These gorgets were about the size of saucers. They are about 1/4 of an inch thick. They were worn around the neck, mainly fairly close to the throat. In fact, the word gorget refers to a piece of medieval armor that was used in Europe that protected the throat, a piece of metal that protected the throat. So these two gorgets were found at Spiro, along with something over 1,000 other, probably, this is kind of an estimate, a little bit over 1,000 different pieces of engraved marine shell. This shell was mostly the shells of large marine whelk shells. Most of the engraved shell there was in the form of cups, large cups. But sometimes they would do these cutouts, these disc-shaped cutouts, and make these gorgets. Here you see the holes in the one on the right, where it was strung up and allowed the wearer to wear it around the neck. And I went through all of the volumes of Phillips and Brown's prehistoric shell engravings from the Spiro site in Oklahoma. And I was looking for images of musical instruments. And when I came to this, I was struck by how closely it resembled a famous image from Mexico of two anthropomorphic figures facing each other over a pot, except that pot was not a pot, it was a drum, a ceramic drum. So it got me thinking about this, and it made me wonder if perhaps there was a ceramic drum tradition in the Southeast prior to European contact. Now, these shell objects were buried in the Craig Mound around about 1400 or so, but they're probably older than that. The thing about Spiro is we don't have time to talk about it too much. It's probably one of the most important archaeological sites in North America, north of Mexico, if not the most important. But for some reason, thousands of special sacred objects were brought to this site and buried there along about 1400. Most of them were kind of heirloom pieces, we think. Some of them, these gorgets, for example, might have been 100 years old when they were buried there. So we don't know exactly. But anyway, they provide us a look into what was going on in the Southeast prior to the coming of Europeans. And it's probably the best collection of iconography from the Southeast anywhere to be found. Well, after I saw this, I began to look around to see if I could find some other examples, and I came across this one. This is not from Spiro. This is from the Old Town Ridge site in northeastern Arkansas. And it's clearly a different scene than the ones we just were looking at, but it is the same pot, which I found to be very interesting. Now, in order for you to see this a little better, I asked my late son-in-law to draw all the pots for me so we could put them side by side. So Jamie Brandon drew this for me. And you can instantly see that these are meant to be the same pot. The decorations on them are close enough that obviously the intended audience would have recognized them and understood what their meaning and significance was and what they symbolized. So in a way, you have to think about iconography as being something that was made for a particular audience. So that they would understand what they were looking at, like a brand, like say a Nike swoosh or one of those Amazon arrows. But since these pots are probably intended to be the same pot, but there is a difference between the Old Town Ridge pot and the Spiro pots. And right away you can see what it is. Right up here, we see this bar across the top of the Spiro pots. And notice it's not on this pot, okay, from Old Town Ridge. And in fact, you can see that without that bar across the top, you have an equal arm cross here on the Old Town Ridge pot. But the upper arm of that cross has been covered here because something has been placed over the top of that cross and over the mouth of these two pots. And that something, I believe, was the head of the drum. This is a stylized rendering of it. Of course, these aren't naturalistic drawings. They are figurative, but they're often highly stylized. So keep that in mind. So this just whetted my appetite to find out, was there a ceramic drum tradition in the South that dates back to pre-European times? So my next stop was looking at historical records. So I went to the earliest European records from the Southeast, and this was De Soto's Entrada. And all the chronicles of De Soto's adventures in the Southeast between 1539 and 1540, 43, I guess it was, all of them based on interviews after interviews with survivors after they escaped from the Southeast. All of them mention drums. And sometimes in very significant circumstances, like when they were attacked at Chicasa and almost wiped out, the Indians attacked them to the beat of drums, which is something they clearly remembered and couldn't forget. So there was a drumming tradition in the Southeast, but there's no description of what those drums were like. So I looked further. In the Southeast, there's some early English records of drums and some descriptions. And these drums were described as clay pots with deerskin hide stretched over the mouth and tied with cordage. So I continued to look. I went over to look at French records, and probably the earliest reference to ceramic drums by the French was La Salle. La Salle's expedition from the Great Lakes down to the mouth of the Mississippi was interrupted near the mouth of the Arkansas River by the Quapaw Indians. And at first there was some hostility, and then La Salle held up a calumet, a peace pipe, and the Quapaw were into the calumet ceremony. So they stopped there and they had a big calumet ritual. And in that ceremony, drums were played. One of La Salle's men wrote a description of this ceremony, and he included a description of the drums. And it was just like others I'd seen from the Southeast coast. And that was that they were clay pots with deer hide stretched over the mouth and tied with cordage. So it was beginning to look pretty good for this ceramic drum tradition. I looked on and found several other references to these, and finally came to this one, which was pretty convincing. In 1718, there was a young French lieutenant whose name was Dumont de Montigny, who was stationed for 2 years among the Natchez Indians in the lower Mississippi Valley. Dumont also traveled around. He went up the Arkansas River with La Harpe, for example, had dealings with the Quapaw and several other tribes. And he described, after he left the New World and went back to France, he wrote his memoirs. And in those memoirs, he described much of what he had experienced and what he had seen. And it's pretty detailed and very interesting reading. This document wasn't translated into English until I think about 10 or so years ago. But Dumont talked about the drums the Natchez used, and he described them as clay pots with deerskin stretched over their mouths, fastened by cordage. And not only did he do a written description, he actually drew a picture of them. And that's what you see right here. By the way, that's a calumet that he drew. He wasn't the world's greatest artist, but he drew several kinds of musical instruments, mostly rattles, but this is a drum, and it's just a clay pot, and there's the head of the drum. Just beginning to look a little bit familiar here. I went on and looked at some more descriptions of European encounters with natives of the Southeast. And I found that the Creeks, for example, were using in the mid to late 1700s, were using clay pot drums. So I'm pretty sure there was a tradition of ceramic drums in the Southeast dating back before the time of Europeans. So I became curious about how long this tradition might have lasted. So before we leave the Natchez, a contemporary of Dumont was a man named Lepage du Prat. I think he was a merchant and a trader, not a soldier. But he too spent time with the Natchez and described their rituals and ceremonies. And he too described these clay pot drums. And he drew a picture of one being used in context here in this dance circle. In the middle of the circle is a man sitting with one of these drums in his lap. And as he plays, the men who form the outside circle, I think, went around in a clockwise manner, and the women went around the inner circle in counterclockwise way. And some of the women appear to be possibly holding handheld frame drums. Now, DuPratz doesn't say anything about that, but sure looks like it. These up here are holding different bundles of various kinds, but these in this area here, those sure look like drums. But anyway, so there's another mention of clay pot drums. Then I moved on to some ethnographic information. This is a drawing by an ethnographer named Frank Speck. And this drawing was made approximately at the same time as Francis Denmore's photograph was being made. Frank Speck visited the Yuchi people who were then living in Oklahoma. Now, the Yuchi originally lived in the southern Appalachian area. And although they didn't speak a Muskogean language, in fact, they spoke a language that no one, I think, has been able to exactly figure out which family it belongs in. But anyway, they were closely related, allied at least, with the Creeks, the Muskogean Creeks. And they adopted much of the Creek square ground ceremonialism. And we know from early European records that in their square ground ceremonies, the Creeks used clay pot drums. And it just so happens that when the Yuchi and the Creeks were moved over into Oklahoma, the Yuchi carried on their clay pot ceramic drum tradition and were still using it in the early 20th century. Now, the interesting thing about this particular drum that Speck drew is that he shows that there was something painted on the head of the drum. And what you have here are these wedge shapes. They're like slices of a pie. And there are 8 of them if you count them. And according to Speck, these were all painted a different color. And each one represented a particular cardinal or semi-cardinal direction, along with attributes of those particular directions. That's something that no one else had mentioned before, but I imagine that there were probably decorations on some of the other drums that just weren't talked about. So here is a ceramic drum being used in the early 20th century. Now, I don't know of any contemporary use of such drums among Native American groups in the Southeast or anywhere else, but I do know that in the Native American church, they use drums made from pots, but those pots are cast iron pots, and they're small drums like these would have been. So in a way, the tradition of this kind of drum use is still being practiced. Okay, now what all of this tells me is that these drums were special and that they were used mostly in ritual and ceremonial occasions. So I've gone back here and now you see down below the two spiral gorgets. And we didn't talk about what these represented or what they meant. But up above, you see three examples of what are called Hicks style gorgets. These are shell gorgets. They're from the Tennessee Valley, and I think something like 32 or so of these things have been found. If you look carefully and compare the Hicks gorgets with the spiral gorgets, what you notice is that really the Hicks gorgets are just simplified versions of the images you see in the spiral gorgets. Now, fortunately, I didn't have to figure out what all this meant because George Langford had already done that about 15 years ago. He wrote a brilliant analysis of Hicks style and Cox Mound gorges, in which he said that what the Hicks gorgets were pictures of the cosmos. They were cosmograms, if you will. Now notice the elements that are found here. Well, he mentioned pots. You can clearly see that what the birds are really standing on is a pot. You can see it here. There's a band across the top of the pot. Here it's very stylized, but there's the band, and here is, or the bar, and here is the pot down here, and the birds up here, and this pole running through the middle. Okay, the pot represents the earth and the underworld. It's perfect, a metaphor for the beneath world, because the beneath world is said to be watery. And pots are made from water and earth. The head of and by the way, what George used to explain this was the mythology surrounding the Algonquian drums that I showed you earlier. But he didn't, for some reason, recognize that these pots were more than just pots. They were drums. I think he didn't know much about this ceramic drum tradition at that time. So let's think of these as what they are, because he used that same mythology. And according to Algonquian mythology, Grandfather Bear took the cosmic tree that connected all the levels of the cosmos and pushed it up through all the layers. And the pole represents, as Langford said, the cosmic tree that connected all the levels of the cosmos. The pot represented the beneath world, especially if it had water in it. The bar across the top was the middle world. And then the birds were above world creatures. And you remember the drumstick was thought of as a bird. Sometimes the Ojibwa told Dinsmore that this bird was a loon. Other times they told her it was an owl. And I've seen one actually carved in the shape of a woodpecker, a pileated woodpecker. So if you look at the spiral gorgets, you can see that they too are cosmograms. They're just a little more complicated. The two anthropomorphic figures are anthropomorphic representations of the birds, which are probably thunderbirds or weather deities of some kind. You can see bird references in their costumes. Here's an actual bird, here's a feather fan. And these are probably wings, they're meant to be wings here. So it's the same scene, it's just a much more detailed and elaborate version of it. Here's the pole, here's the pot, here's the bar, and this is called an entwined band motif. And some have said it's steam, some say it's smoke. I say it's probably sound. because the thing about it, when the tree was pushed up, the branches, it branched out across the sky, and you can see how it's kind of expanding as it goes up. And I'm pretty sure that that's what's going on here. But instead of a wooden drum, you've got a ceramic drum, which is a somewhat different tradition than what you found in the north, that you found in the southeast. Also, interesting thing, you see this device here. Okay, this is probably what is drawn or painted on the head of the drum. And there are these little pie-shaped wedges. There are 8 of them, just like on the Yuchi drum. And this is a symbol here for the center of the cosmos, the center of the world, this cross in a circle, and also for the sacred fire and relationship to the sun above. So, so if there was a ceramic drum tradition and it was so meaningful and important and sacred, where are the drums? Okay. I think, as I said before, they're hiding in plain sight. They look pretty much like pots, just like any other pot. But, and they're sitting on shelves in museums all across the country. It's just, how do you recognize them? Well, I got my friend Chase Earls to make me a pot, a ceramic drum, a pot drum. It's small, but my idea was to play it for a period of time and then to remove the head of it and look for signs, some possible diagnostic use wear patterns. Now, Chase made this drum. It's from Red River clay. It's grog tempered. He made it in the traditional manner. It's pretty thick walled, and he fired it in the traditional way. And I actually didn't ask him to decorate it. At least I don't think I did. I don't remember that I did, but I did send him pictures of the Spyro drums. And he put the cross in the concentric semicircles that was on the neck of the pots on the side of this small drum. And it turns out, by the way, would you like to hear what it sounds like? I have it right here. It's small, so it has a small voice, but it has a good sound. So anyway, I had this drum sitting on the shelf, turned so I could see the side of it. It was sitting there and I kept thinking, a bell kept ringing in my head saying, what is this? Why does this look so familiar to me? And then I realized what it was. Take a look. There it is. It's the same drum as the Spyro drum. It's just a different side of it that you're looking at. So that was totally serendipity because I don't, unless Chase had figured this out already, because I hadn't. And, but anyway, so the idea is once I play it for a while, and if I can find some wear patterns on the drum, on the lip and the rim and the neck of the drum, that might be diagnostic, that would tell me that this is what happens when you use a pot as a drum, then perhaps we can identify some of these drums that are sitting around going unnoticed. The other thing I would like to do is look at a collection of Mexican drums and compare to see if they have the same wear patterns on them. So the search continues, and that's the point at which I've come to a stop. and I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jim. I mean, that was amazing. I love iconography, and the way you pulled things together is really amazing. So are there any questions for Jim?
And if you happen to know where an actual ceramic drum artifact is, I'd like to know about it.
Have you seen the ceramic drum at the Museum of Red River? That's from Chase.
From Chase?
Yes.
No, well, is it the large one? I have seen a drum there. It's not an
Sorry.
ancient one though, is it? Or is it?
In their collection, and this is before they remodeled, they had, I think it was a Hopi drum.
Oh,
but
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know how old it was, but I saw that it had its head on it. That
Yeah.
was with cordage.
Yeah. I didn't show you another photograph by Dinsmore of a drum from Zuni. And it's just a pot with with a deerskin head. And it dates from the 1950s, that particular one. But there are accounts, I think, from Cushing and Matilda Stevenson and Elsie Clues Parson and some of those ethnographers who studied in the Southwest or studied the people of the Southwest. There are accounts in all of their writings of the use of clay pot drums like that. So there is that tradition in the Southwest as well as,
Yeah.
I think, now in the Southeast. Yeah.
I just wonder, I mean, you probably can't do any analysis on the piece that they have there at the museum, but if it has wear on it, from being used, because I think has been used.
Yeah, I'll have to talk to Henry and see
Yeah, talk to Henry.
if he'll let me come and look at it. But he was very generous with Mark and I several years ago. And he has a whistle there that came from Arkansas, a ceramic whistle. And he let Mark Howell and I go down and do all kinds of things with it, probably that we shouldn't have done, but we didn't harm it. And so they've been very nice about letting us study their stuff. So that's good. I'm glad you told me about that because I didn't know they had a Hopi drum there.
Well, I think it's Hopi. I think it's been a minute since I saw it, but I
Yeah.
did not remember it when you approached me.
Yeah, yeah. Did you just come up with the idea to decorate this pot? Because I don't remember that, since I was just going to use it as.
You said for me to come up with what I wanted to.
Okay, right.
That is, and I did already know about the angular.
But don't you think it's cool that it looks
Yeah.
just like
Well, there was two things I was trying to show. Was number one, what you just pointed out here in this picture, that
yeah,
from a different angle it shows the same thing, but also from the front, or if it is the front, that the top bar, when the head is on it, it does cover the top portion of that cross or that.
right.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't come down as far as I wanted. That had to do with any experience about cutting drum heads lengths. But if there was excess drum head, which there should have been, that comes down below the tie-off point, then it would have covered that plus completely.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm very pleased with it. It works well, and I hesitate to ever take the head off of it because I don't know if I could get it back on.
I will put it back on for you, no problem.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. But yeah, I'm thinking that maybe there will be some use wear on it, and that we could use to identify other pots that have been used as drums. We'll see.
All right, so Jim, Cecilia has asked a question. How does one know that they have found a drum rather than just a pot?
Well, at present, there is hardly any way to know, okay? Because the heads of the drums have long since deteriorated and disappeared. So if you found a ceramic drum, it would just look like any other pot. It might have some special design or decoration on it. That's something else that I'm looking into. But other than that, I don't think you'd be able to tell. Now, what I've read in the historical documents is that these drums were generally pretty small. These pots were small. They probably had somewhat thicker walls in order to stand up to the pressure of being pounded on.
Yeah.
But yeah, in fact, let's see. I don't know. Can you still see? This is a drum from Mexico. Does it look familiar? Does sort of doesn't. Remember the spiral gorgets?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, this is two views of the same drum. These are very small. This part, the pedestal here, okay, was generally held under the arm, the left arm. And in Mexico, they generally played these drums. The Maya and other peoples there played them with their hands, like you'd play a bongo drum, sort of. And often they would hold a rattle in the hand. They were holding the drum under the arm. But this is an unusual shape. This is one of 4 identical drums that was found as a dedicatory offering underneath the main temple of the ancient city of Xochicalco in central Mexico. Turns out Xochicalco was a Maya outpost or trading post. And many of the people that lived there were Maya, and they were craftsmen. And this city rose as Teotihuacan began to decline. And it's thought that the Maya population that lived in Teotihuacan immigrated to Xochicalco, and it started to grow at that time. But the interesting thing is, there were 4 pots like this that were placed so as to represent the 4 cardinal directions. And the pedestal, of course, sort of like the pole, represented the axis mundi. And it was said that that temple was the center of the world. So the symbolism of the Ojibwa drum, of the spiral drums, of all of these drums, and including the ones in Mexico, was the same. And that really struck me when I saw this. So this is a very ancient symbolism and mythology, and it goes, and the drum is a major part of it, whether it's a wooden drum or a ceramic drum. The mythology is pretty much the same all the way from Canada down into Mexico. So I found that rather fascinating.
Yeah. So Cecilia would like to know, would the drum have had an opening at the bottom or sides to assist with sound?
The Maya drum you see here was open at the bottom. Okay. But from what I can tell, the drums north of the border were not open in the bottom. It's possible they might have had some holes in them. I was reading the other day about Neolithic drums in China, and most of those drums, they were ceramic drums, like we're talking about, did have small openings sometimes, I suppose to affect the sound of the drum. But that doesn't seem to be the case when you get north of Mexico.
Benjamin Barnes asks, examples of the interweaving, I don't know how to pronounce this, Giluch pattern emerging from the Spiro Gorgets are reminiscence of the neck decorations, sorry, neck decorations on the ceramics from Fort Ancient sites along the Ohio River.
Mhm.
I think it's Giluch, sorry.
Yeah, I know what he's talking about, but I don't know much about that. So
Yeah,
that's not anything I can add anything to. It's interesting though.
it is. Are there any other questions? All right. And then Chase, is that Shawnee Ben? I don't know. I guess that was directed to Ben. Yes, he said. All right, you all need to have your own talk. But thank you very much for you all being here. And I really appreciate your support. And March is Archaeology Month in Arkansas. So stick around though, because we'll probably be doing a few more of these until maybe COVID's over. We get comfortable with the Arkansas Archaeological Society's chapters getting back together. Although I think they're kind of fun, these monthly meetings. So I may still continue doing. Thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate it. It was so interesting.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to do it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.